Good evening, everyone, and it's nice to welcome you onto this Zoom webinar. My name is Lafraz. I live just up the road from St. Nick's Sevenoaks in Orpington with my wife Suzanne and our three kids. And my boy just broke a wooden spoon as he was clapping for the NHS. So I hope you enjoyed your clap. We need to get a new wooden spoon for the kitchen. It's nice to be with you. I speak to lots of people who want to make a start with the Bible. They want to give it a go. They want to read it. They want to know what it says for themselves. But sometimes find that a difficult thing to do. It's a big book. It was written in a context very different from ours. And some people have given it a go and found it hard going. And as with any new experience, it's sometimes helpful to have someone to connect you to that experience. And that's what we're doing tonight. We're just looking to make a start with the Bible. We're going to be using some notes that I use regularly. Let me just share screen there. Give me a sec. We're going to be using the word one-to-one, which is some notes that I tend to use when I introduce people to the Bible, and I just want to show you those notes on the screen. And it's basically the Bible with notes. It's John's Gospel with notes, a framework for a conversation, a chat through the Bible. John, who wrote this book, one of the books of the Bible, he was with Jesus for 3 years, and he saw everything that Jesus did. He heard everything that Jesus taught. And his witness, the things that he writes down, is on the left. That's the Bible text. And on the right is just some notes that give us a bit of context and help us to unpack those notes and to talk through them. And I've read with many people who have found that a very engaging experience, normally one-to-one in a coffee shop, but we're going to try something different today. And your guide is not going to be me, it's going to be Angus McClay, who's the rector at St. Nick's Sevenoaks. And I'm going to introduce him to you in a second. But before I do that, I just want to encourage you. My job is just to drive the notes tonight. And then what I'd also like to do is I'd like to field your questions. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little Q&A icon. And if you can click on that Q&A icon whenever you have a question, you type your question in there. I'll see it on my screen. And then when the time comes, I'll field those questions. I'll organize them and I'll ask Angus those questions probably towards the end of the session. That's it for me. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Angus. Angus, if you unmute, and then over to you.
Lafraz, thank you very much indeed. Well, welcome to everybody who's joined. There's quite a few on this call, so thank you very much for joining. As Lafraz says, my name's Angus McClay. I'm the rector of St. Nicholas Sevenoaks. I've been here since 2001. I'm married to Sue, who's in the room with me. We've got 2 married children and a couple of grandchildren. What's going to happen? Well, we're going to look together at the first part of John's Gospel, and I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'm not preaching a sermon, but it's rather like a friend sitting next to you in the coffee shop, trying to explain something which you may not have looked at in any great detail beforehand. And as Lafraz says, do use that Q&A function. We will definitely have finished by 9 o'clock, so do be aware of that. What is John's Gospel? It's a little bit like a biography. Written by John, one of Jesus's disciples, so written before John died. John died probably round about AD 90, so clearly written before then, an eyewitness account, and therefore reliable for getting a really good view of who Jesus is. Why was it written? Well, if I jump to the very end of John's Gospel, this is what John says. He says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So the events that John records were written so that people could weigh up the evidence, as we're going to do tonight, so that they could put their trust, their confidence in Jesus, and as a result, discover new life. The focus is always on the person of Jesus. So we're going to turn to this book that Lafraz mentioned. We've got the overview that we're looking at, verses 1 to 18, the very start of John's Gospel. And I think there's a page that hopefully, Lafraz, you can put on the screen for everybody to have a look at. Is that okay? Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Now, verses 1 to 18 of John's Gospel functions like an overture for a symphony, where you hear briefly all the main themes at the start of the evening, which then will appear the rest of the evening. And so verses 1 to 18, you've got at the start, this overture, and the main themes will appear in the rest of the book. There's a lot here, so we'll need to move slowly. And it may interest you that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, well, they begin with the birth of Jesus, but John, as we'll soon find out, starts much, much further back. So we'll move on to the next page. Thank you very much indeed, Lafraz, where we have this person called the Word, who is introduced. Now, as Lafraz explained, the Bible text is on the left. I'll read that. And then there's some comment that is on the right that I'll seek to explain. So let me read. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's all about a person. Notice in that little 2, that's a verse 2, he was with God in the beginning. It's a person, and he's called or described as the Word. We see that used a number of times, 3 times in verse 1. Twice in a couple of verses, he is described as being with God. And a couple of times, he is described as being with God in the beginning. So there he is, the Word. He's a person. He's there in the beginning with God. But the astounding thing that is mentioned in verse 1 is that he's not just with God, but he was God. Now, as we move through verse 3, see, we'll be moving quickly. We notice that he made everything. All things were made through him. And that is put both positively and negatively. So all things were made through him. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. You look round in your room, wherever you are just now, accessing this, and perhaps there's lots of stuff that you purchased at various stages over the years, but there may be some stuff there that wasn't bought by you. So it's not all purchased by you. Whereas the Word looks out on the cosmos, and there's nothing there that has not been put there by him. So he is the creator of everything. Then if you look down at verses 4 and 5, he is described as the source of life, and that gives light. So again, just imagine in your room, chances are there may be a light on. There is a live electric current somewhere which is delivering that light. If there were to be a power cut, not only would you not be hearing me, but the light would go out. But there has been no power cut with the Word, as we see in verse 5. He has been delivering life and light over the last 2,000 years. So let's see what we have here then. The Word, whoever this Word is, will be revealed soon, is God. He's the creator and he's the life giver. So we've made a start. Let's keep going as we turn to our next page. So the Word has been introduced to us, and now as we come to verses, the next little section, we see that the Word appeared. So in that section, let me read it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Now, there's a reference to somebody in verse 6 called John. That is not the person who wrote the gospel. As you'll see, that is another John. That is John the Baptist. He was the sensation of the day, a popular speaker, somebody who had been on the news regularly. Verse 7, his role was to point to the light. Verse 8, he himself was not the light. He knew that he wasn't the light. He was just a witness to it. And this light, verse 9, was entering the world. So John the Baptist functions a little bit like a trailer for a film, showing us what's going to happen. But the trailer isn't the film itself. It's designed to encourage people to watch and listen to the film. And that was the role of John the Baptist. But we still need to go further. So we go to the next page, next little section. Excuse me. He was in the world. This is referring back to the Word again. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Now, what is being described here is as the Word entered history, and John the Baptist is pointing to him. We see that when he entered history, he divided opinion, still does today. One of the things I love for breakfast is Marmite. And it's one of those things, isn't it? You love it or hate it. And certainly people either loved or hated the Word as he entered the world. So verse 10, many people rejected him. It says the world did not recognize him. Not just other people, but it was also his own, which is a reference to his own people, the Jews, did also rejected him. But that's only one side of the story. And as we get to verse 12, many people did receive him. How did they receive him? Well, again, in verse 12, they believed in his name. Now, belief is one of those ideas which it's been painted with particular religious colors, but it means that you put your confidence in somebody. So if you trust or believe your doctor, you put your confidence in her or him. And that is what is being said here, that although some rejected the Word, other people put their confidence in him. And what happened? Well, it says in verse 12, he gave them the right to become children of God. Well, just imagine, for example, an orphan. So somebody has gone through tragic circumstances. Just imagine that they're adopted by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. Well, they enter into a royal household. They, and if they're fully adopted, they've got the legal rights of belonging to that household. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing. We could barely contemplate it, but that is a sort of image that is being used here for those who put their confidence in this person who up to this point is still called the Word. He enables them to be adopted into God's household. So a Christian, verse 13, is not someone who is born into a religious family. They're not somebody who suddenly becomes religious or who is told by somebody else to be religious. No, it's someone who has been welcomed personally into God's family, as verse 13 says, born of God. So the first movement, verses 1 to 5, was very much about introducing this person called the Word. And then the last couple of pages in the Bible, verses 6 to 13, we've been seeing the Word enter history. And now in this next section, which is the next few pages of our little booklet, from verses 14 through to verse 18, we see the world revealed. So let me read this verse. Very famous verse. You may be familiar with it from Christmas carol concerts, 9 lessons and carols. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, who is this person called the Word? Well, it says there the Word became flesh. Back in verse 1, we were told that the Word was God, but now we find out that this Word became human, and he is therefore somebody who understands us and understands our world. And he came and made his dwelling amongst us. In other words, God came to live amongst us and with us. There's a popular paraphrase of the Bible that says that the Word became flesh and moved into our neighborhood, which somehow picks up this idea, no longer at a distance in heaven, but actually right in amongst us. We're in the stages, I'm not quite sure if it's ever going to happen, but of moving my mother-in-law, Sue's mum, from Lancashire into Sevenoaks. So from a far distance to be right with us. But here, this is the Word, God himself moving close to be with us, round the corner. So people at that time, they saw him. And what did they see? They saw his glory. Well, what does that mean? This glory of the one and only Son. What was it that especially shone out from his character? Well, we might have expected God to be revealed in thunderbolts and power, but actually the glory of the Word, the glory of the Son, the glory of God was revealed in the fact that he was, if you see on the screen, he was full of grace and truth. Now let's move on to our next screen page, and that is further developed, because you'll see there his main purpose. Verse 15, John the Baptist, I'll read it to us, he is clearly not the Word. John, that's John the Baptist still, testified concerning him. He cried out saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So if John the Baptist, he's not the Word, but he's pointing to the Word. And the Word is the one, verse 16, who brings grace in place of grace. Now it's quite a strange phrase. It's not the sort of thing that we would normally say. But just imagine you're at the seaside. Perhaps it's difficult to imagine that just now with all the restrictions. But you see wave after wave coming. And if you keep your focus on one particular part of the sea, you'll see wave replacing wave. It just never stops. And so it is with the grace poured out by this person called the Word. Grace in place of grace. The Word never stops bringing grace. The Old Testament, verse 17, brought the law. Nothing wrong with the law. The law is good. It helps us to know what's right and wrong, though not quite so good if it continually highlights our failures. But this person brings grace, not law, grace, not rules. And finally, the disciple John tells us who it's all about, that this Word, the Word who brings grace, is none other than Jesus Christ. And so we move to our final verse for the evening, verse 18. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. See, nobody in the Old Testament had seen God. Well, they'd seen glimpses of his glory, like Moses. But now something momentous has happened. Jesus, God himself, who has always been with God, who has always been God, has made God known to us. And that is the astounding claim that in a sense sets up the rest of John's gospel. That whenever you look at Jesus, the Son, the Word, you're actually seeing the Father. Indeed, Jesus actually says that a little bit later to one of his disciples, Philip, in John chapter 14. If you look at Jesus, you see God. And there's that light bulb moment. He brings us light so that as we see Jesus, we see God, and we're able to receive grace, his undeserved love and life in God's family. So I think we, as we glance down just at the right-hand side of that page that Lafraz has put out for us, there's an amazing list there of what we've discovered this evening about Jesus. And as you go through that list, and I won't go through it, you can read it on your screen, it is a slightly bigger Jesus, isn't it, than perhaps we thought we were going to look at. Very, very different from the Sunday school picture of Jesus meek and mild. This is God himself. Perhaps just one final little illustration. Just imagine you're doing some work in the garden. Perhaps you've planted some things and you want to water the plants, and you get your bucket and it's full to the brim of water. And as you're taking it outside, you bump it into your knee and a little bit of water splashes out. Well, of course it did, because it's full of water. You bump into the bucket, and because it's full of water, water flows out. Jesus is full of grace. You bump into him and outpours grace. And that's something for each of us perhaps to ponder, as to not just finding out facts about John's gospel, and hopefully you've got some questions that you might want to be putting, but perhaps that encounter with Jesus to actually receive something of his undeserved love and favor is something that we could flow out of this evening. If you go to the next set of pages, you'll see there that there's the passage in front of us, and You can read through that, and indeed, I'm sure there's ways in which you can download this yourself, or download a copy of the John's Gospel so that you can read through that. But I've said plenty. We still got 20 minutes for questions, and so I think I'm going to hand back to Lafraz, and if there are questions, then it will be great to seek to handle them. So back to you, Lafraz.
Good, Angus. Thank you. Thank you so much for walking through that so clearly. Very, very helpful. Please keep those questions coming. I've got a couple to start with. I think I'll give them both to you because they seem slightly related, and you can deal with them as you please. So first question is, why wasn't it more obvious that Jesus was God's son? So why, when he came, why did the world not recognize him? And the second question is, why did Jesus need someone to introduce him? So John the Baptist, why did he need that introduction?
Well, I think
please
those
keep
are both
some other questions coming whilst Angus deals with that. Thank you.
Yeah. These are both good questions. I think that as you go through John's Gospel, you'll see that that Jesus is constantly doing what the other Gospels call miracles, but actually John always calls signs which point to who he is. But the thing with a signpost is that you can take a signpost at face value and follow it and get to the destination. Or you can look at the signpost, and say, oh, I'm not sure about that. I don't think that signpost is correct. I think somebody's tampered with it or moved it. And you trust your own sort of instinct, and you just say, that just can't be right. And so even when we are presented these days with compelling evidence of something, we often don't necessarily follow it. We suspend judgment, and we're not quite sure. We're not willing necessarily to put our confidence in it. So even nowadays, that there would be plenty folk who would be skeptical about all sorts of things, science, things in science. We make our own minds up. So it's exactly the same with the evidence that John presents for us. Some people looked at it and they said, yeah, I'm going to check out where that signpost leads. Other folk felt, no, I think I know the right way anyway. I don't really need the signpost. I mean, I don't need a map. I'll get there. So I think that's why there is that ambivalence. Second question was about, why did Jesus need this warm-up act? And I guess there's a couple of ways to answer that. In the Old Testament, there were a number of times, and in fact, we'll see this next week if you come back, because John the Baptist said, look, I'm not these sort of characters. I'm just preparing for the one to come, because within the Old Testament, there was a recognition that before the person called the Messiah, who we now know as Jesus, came, there would be a prophet called Elijah, or with an Elijah type ministry. So there was the expectation that there would be a messenger. And I guess, again, why does it have to be? Well, just in the same way that if the Queen was going to come to visit Sevenoaks, you'd be pretty sure that some of her retinue would come first, just to scout things out, make sure everything is okay, make sure that people know that it really is her coming, that it's not somebody isn't playing a game. No, it's genuine, and they would prepare the way. And that is what is happening with John the Baptist. He is somebody who is designed to prepare the way. But as I say, a little bit more will come out in John's Gospel next Thursday, if you care to join us. Next, one of the sadnesses of this sort of thing, of course, is that it's difficult to have comeback. Although if you do want to come back to any of those questions, again, do fire a Q&A to Lafraz and perhaps we can pick that up. So Lafraz, next question.
Just to clarify, I thought the Queen regularly visited Sevenoaks. So another question on the grace given. So what is the grace that was already given, and why did we need new grace?
Okay. Well, verse 16 that we haven't got on the screen now, but you could always get to it. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. And lovely, thank you very much indeed, Lafraz, that it may well be a reference to the fact that even within the Old Testament, we're accustomed to think of the Old Testament as law. And certainly it is full of law. Verse 17, the law was given through Moses. But nevertheless, there is much of the Old Testament where God had given grace. Indeed, if you look on the right-hand side of the page, one of those bullet points, it says God has already given grace in the Old Testament. And so there were lots of things where God had helped his people, the Israelites, where he simply didn't have to. So they were pretty ungrateful in all sorts of ways, yet he rescued them from Egypt, the time of the Exodus, with the Passover again that we'll look at next week. And so that was an experience of grace that they had received. And there are loads of episodes of this. They're grumbling. They get a bad king, King Saul. And in God's kindness and goodness, he gives them a new king, David. It's a sign of his love, his favor, his grace. So actually, there are tiny episodes all the way through history in the Old Testament where grace has been received, but is all preparing for the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, where all these, as it were, tiny waves find their fulfillment, if you like, in a tsunami of this enormous wave of the Lord Jesus Christ, who pours out his grace in ways which we simply cannot imagine, picking us up out of our sinfulness and enabling us to be freely forgiven. So I think grace in place of grace, I think it's John is trying to say that there had been these episodes all the way through the Old Testament, but here ultimately is the taste of grace that we've been looking for.
Thanks, Angus. Did Jesus exist before he was born?
Yes. So what we're told here in verse 1 is, in the beginning was the Word. Now, yes, John takes 17 verses to, well, verse 14 to say the Word became flesh, and then to just give his name, his human name of Jesus. But clearly, it is therefore saying that the person who we now know as Jesus, the Christ, the Anointed One, already existed right at the very beginning. That there are various ways in which we could see this, even from the Old Testament. So right in the opening chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, God says, let us make man in our own image. And many commentators have flagged up that, well, if God is just on his own and Jesus comes later, how does that work? No, Father, Son, and Spirit, they're all there right at the very beginning. And how does God create things? He speaks, his breath, his word goes out. So the word is there right at the beginning. And there are other parts of the Bible. We won't go into these just because I don't want to distract from John's gospel, but if you were to look, for example, you might want to jot this down, Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. It speaks there of Jesus as the one who is the creator of all things. So yeah, Jesus existed long before he was born, but his birth it was a real birth, and there he comes in human form to live in our world.
Thanks, Angus. I think this is probably a follow-up to your grace upon grace explanation, and a question about the people who lived back in the Old Testament times. And how did they receive the grace of Christ, or was that an option for them?
Again, you might want to jot this down if you're wanting to follow things up. It's quite a dense passage, but Romans chapter 3, verses 21 to 26 talks about how what Christ has achieved on the cross has both backwards and forwards application to us. So just imagine, just trying to explain it, you incur a debt on your credit card, and it's going to be paid off in a month's time. But you have that assurance that it is going to be paid at the end of that month. So even though the debt has been paid and somebody assures you that it's all going to be sorted, that there will be a once and for all payment that is going to be made that is covering it. And in the same way, in the Old Testament, the believers, that there were various sacrifices that made available, which pointed to what Jesus was going to do. And again, one of these we'll look at next week, the idea of Jesus as the Lamb of God. But in a sense, they're all pointing to the transaction that is going to take place 33 AD or thereabouts, when Jesus dies on the cross. So people in the Old Testament, their sins could still be completely paid for, but actually only through the payment made by the Lord Jesus Christ. So that there aren't two ways to get forgiven or to get into heaven. If you're in the Old Testament, you need a sacrifice, and if you're in the New Testament era, well, you can rely on Christ. No, everything focuses on that once and for all payment in the middle of history. But if you're in the Old Testament, you have a sacrifice that points you to the full forgiveness that is available through Jesus.
Thanks, Angus. We've dealt with all the questions bar one, and this feels like a good one to finish with. So why is following Jesus a better option than another religious system or another religious leader? Why is following Jesus better than anything else?
I guess I would look at two aspects to this, and it's not wanting to denigrate other religions in terms of producing folk who might be able to act morally and helpfully in the world and everything. I would say look at the identity of Jesus, and is any other religion claiming that somebody who walked on the earth is actually God himself, who understands us, who knows us, who is experienced life like us? And so what we're given in the Lord Jesus Christ, in his identity, is someone who who understands us, who loves us. And then I would say, look not just at his identity, but look at his work. He is not saying to us, come on, Angus, try a bit harder. You can do it. If only you were more patient, or if only you followed this system, you'd be able to get your life together. So one of the common features of so many other religions or other philosophies. It's all about what you've got to do. Whereas Christianity is all about what Jesus Christ has done. And therefore, this links in again with that word grace. Christianity is not about what I do. It's about what Jesus has done for me, dying in my place. So as I look at other religions, I can admire all sorts of things, but there's nobody that they're producing who is God and yet understands our weaknesses, sorrow, bereavement. He's actually gone through death, all these things, the identity of Jesus. And there is no other religion that can enable me to receive that forgiveness that Jesus has completely achieved when he died on the cross. So I think that would be my answer to those, but they're good questions, good questions.
Thanks, Angus. And a God who stepped into this world, this broken world, is such a comfort to those of us who follow him. Thank you for that. Can I ask you, how should people follow up if they found this interesting, they want to see more? How should people follow up?
I guess there's a number of things. I mean, first of all, we'll be back next week, same time, 8:15. We'll have the line open a few minutes beforehand, just so that folk can get in. And we'll be doing the next little section of John's Gospel. So do follow that up. I'd also say that you're very welcome to get in touch with us at St. Nicholas Sevenoaks by going to our website. So just St. Nicholas Sevenoaks, and if you get to the website, you'll find there. And if you want to email me, you can certainly email me through the website, and I'd very gladly interact with any other questions during the week. And indeed, if you want to find out more, we've got our full range of services, live stream services, Zoom services on Sunday. It may be that you want to find out more about the word one-to-one. And I don't know, Lefraz, if you've got the website available for the word one-to-one, if you're wanting perhaps with a friend, perhaps it might even be that you're on this call because a friend has encouraged you to do that and you'd like to link up with them and actually do this at your own pace. And the word one-to-one material that Lefraz has been showing us is available online. And yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it's on the website, and you quite simply go to the word one-to-one, that's the number one-to-one.com, and you just click on get the notes, and it's there for you for free, starting with, well, it's in English and a few other languages. So you just start with book one and you work your way through it as far as you want to go. So please make use of that resource. It's easy to just share on your screen, same as we've done here today. And I do that with a number of friends, and many other people do that with friends who want to have a look in. And I'm sure if you want to connect, if you don't have someone to do that with, I'm sure you can just get in touch with a church office using the email address on the website, and they'll hook you up with someone. Yeah,
no, that's great. I think I'd be struggling with even the simplified Chinese, but great that it's available.
We'll stick to the English. I was wondering whether we could just launch a little poll, because we'd love to know who we were speaking to tonight and what's your current sort of relationship with the Bible. It's all anonymous, so if you could just tick one of those options, and we'll see that. And I think that's it then. I think if you want to chat any feedback to me, we'll stay on for a few more minutes. If there's anything you want to suggest for the next time, this is the first time we do it. So we'd love to learn what would better serve you. And I think that's it then, Angus.
Yep. Well, we're just before 9 o'clock. Lefraz, thank you so much for your assistance, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.